Good afternoon and welcome to yet another event at the LSE South Asia Center. I'm delighted to welcome all of you. This is the second week of term, and we are back with another event, this one focusing on Afghanistan, with a fantastic panel to match, about whom I'll say a bit shortly. But before I begin, before I introduce the panel, I wanted to welcome our audience to this event, also because this is a successive term in which we are doing an event focused on Afghanistan. In the summer term that has just gone by, we did an event as we were approaching 1 year of the taking over of the Taliban, the Taliban coming to power in Afghanistan, and we focused on the Taliban's state building capacity in that event. Today we are going to focus on something else, and that is the future of jihadism in Afghanistan now onwards. Afghanistan has been in the news for several reasons, a lot of them very, very difficult for its peoples, for its citizens, for a variety of reasons that are national, that are domestic or are international, like the freezing of assets, which has led to a very serious economic crisis within the country. They've just come through a very, very difficult winter. But there have also been other issues, some which have made more news than others. A particular one is the banning of education for girls, starting from the age of 11, which has been much talked about. Now, as I mentioned, in August this year, the Taliban marked a year in power, which was celebrated within Afghanistan. It was actually even telecast on international news channels. And this afternoon, we focus on the question of jihadism. And even though this panel was put together earlier in the summer, an event last week has shown that terrorism and terrorist acts are still very, very close to the everyday life of the people in Afghanistan. Most, if not all of you, would have known that there was a bomb blast in Kabul at an institute that was training young girls for education and for examinations. And the blast cost 19 lives and several more were injured. And this only brings closer to home the continuing problem of terrorism, even a year after the Taliban came to power. As I said at the beginning, we have an eminent panel that will discuss all this. But before that, may I not only welcome, but also thank the members of the audience, not only for logging in now, I can see so many of you have logged in, but also for the interest you have shown in the weeks building up to the announcement of this event. For those of you who sent me emails, giving your opinions, giving your views, all of which are always welcome, even if all of them are not always very pleasant. But thank you very much nonetheless. The event is being held via Zoom and is being live streamed on YouTube. The chat function has been enabled, so please ask your questions via the chat function, and we will post them to the panelists once they have made their initial remarks. If this event had been an on-site event at LSE, LSE's regulations mean that members of the audience have the right to ask questions in any live event without necessarily revealing their identity. And trying to remain close to that spirit, when I pose questions to the panel, I will not be announcing your names, even though your names may be visible on YouTube. I will simply pose the question. You're welcome to pose a question to an individual panelist. You are equally welcome to pose a question to the entire panel. Please mention it if you want to pose a question to a particular panelist, and I will ask them accordingly. If you are the kinds who tweet, please do feel free to tweet, and you can tag us at SAsiaLSE. The Twitter handles of the individual panelists are mentioned in the details of the YouTube page that you're looking at the moment. We have had a very brief chat just before we went live on air to discuss the order in which the panelists will speak. And the order in which I introduce them is the order in which they will speak. Each will make initial remarks for about 8 minutes. after which there will be a moderated discussion, and we will, of course, also take on your questions. I will begin with introducing the discussant, Dr. Antonio Giustozzi, who I'm delighted to say has recently joined our center as a senior visiting fellow. And he is the person who actually put together this panel earlier in the summer. And Antonio will speak first and say a few words about what we may expect from the panel. Antonio is currently visiting fellow at LSE South Asia Center and is also affiliated to RUSI. He is otherwise an independent researcher and analyst with a special interest in conflicts, war, security, and strategic issues in Afghanistan and in the region. He has published extensively on the subject, and his book, The Taliban at War, 2001 to 2021, which was published in 2022, was a book for which we at our center at that time held an event which was also extremely well attended. Antonio is the brains and the motor behind the panel today, and he will make some initial remarks. Antonio, our first speaker from the panel will be Barak Mendelsohn, who is professor of political science at Haverford College, which is in Pennsylvania in the United States. And his research interests focus especially on the al-Qaeda movement, and he's the author of Jihadism Constrained, the Limits of Transnational Jihadism and What It Means for Counterterrorism, which was published in 2019. Barak Mendelsohn, welcome. Dr. Ashley Jackson is co-founder and co-director of the Center on Armed Groups, is research associate at ODI Global, London, and at the Conflict, Security and Development Research Group at King's College, London. Ashley has worked in Afghanistan for more than a decade and has published extensively on the Taliban, including very recently negotiating survival, civilian-insurgent relations in Afghanistan. Ashley Jackson, welcome. Finally, I'm delighted to welcome Mohammad Ali, who is an independent consultant and researcher. From 2018 to 2021, Ali was Director General of Strategic Intelligence for the National Security Council of Afghanistan. He has expertise on radical Islamist groups like the Taliban and the al-Qaeda in South Asia, ISIS-Khorasan, drug trafficking and money laundering networks, Afghanistan's politics, economy, and state, as well as Iran's and Pakistan's use of non-state actors in foreign policy. Ali, welcome. I am now going to invite Antonio to speak. Antonio will speak very briefly for about 3-4 minutes and will be followed by Barak Mendelsohn. Antonio.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to say that we actually had planned this event well before the killing of al-Zubayri happening in Kabul at the end of July. That, of course, only reinforces the feeling that this is something that has to be discussed, the future of jihadism in Afghanistan, and the killing, of course, changing the cards a little bit. When we say future jihadis in Afghanistan, of course, we're not only thinking about the implications for Afghanistan of hosting a variety of global jihadist groups, but also the implication for the rest of the world of those groups being there. And for that reason, we have a panel that is able to cover the different dimensions of the presence of these jihadist groups in Afghanistan, the relevance for Afghanistan, for the region, and also for the wider world. Indeed, our first panelist, Barak Mendelsohn, has written about al-Qaeda in particular at the global level, and I'm glad to hand over to him to start the discussion. Thank you.
Barak, you need to switch on your mic.
I'm good now?
Yes.
Everybody can hear me. Well, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for being part of this terrific panel. And I want to thank Antonio especially. I just finished writing a blurb for his new book that's going to come out very soon. And it's just a terrific addition to our literature. So thank you, Antonio, for that. As Antonio suggested, the focus of my work is really on the al-Qaeda movement. And so I will try to say a few words about what I think is the future of al-Qaeda and the significance of Afghanistan for al-Qaeda. With the bottom line is that al-Qaeda, Afghanistan might be a somewhat comfortable place for many al-Qaeda operatives to survive slightly longer, but it's not clear that the future of al-Qaeda is in Afghanistan, and I do not expect Afghanistan to be al-Qaeda to be a serious issue from Afghanistan as opposed to other locations. So let me just start by saying that Afghanistan has been central to the formation and evolution of al-Qaeda. We don't need to dwell on the history to know that fact. It remained so even though the center of gravity for al-Qaeda actually shifted over the years. If you look at the independent operations of al-Qaeda, it's been a lot more active in other regions of the world, especially in Africa, than you see in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, it seems to be playing different kind of coordination roles or financing, maybe even arbitrating between different groups, but the center of gravity for operation is definitely no longer in Afghanistan. Moreover, al-Qaeda currently is in a moment of severe peril, and its importance in Afghanistan is low. Let's start with the turmoil in al-Qaeda. As Antonio suggested, it's been over 2 months since Ayman al-Zawahiri was killed in Kabul. Over 2 months, and we still don't know who's going to succeed him. Now, true, even after bin Laden was killed, it took 6 weeks for al-Qaeda to come up with Zawahiri as the successor, but there was little doubt that this will be the outcome. Very few people expected that it's not going to be Zawahiri, since bin Laden prepared the ground for that. But now Zawahiri is gone, and it's not really clear who's going to be replacing him. And the fact it's been over 2 months suggests 2 possible things. Neither of them is good for al-Qaeda. One, it could be that there is a disagreement over who should be the successor for Zawahiri, which is definitely a real possibility. The second option is that there are severe communication problems, and so al-Qaeda is failing to make that consultation in an effective way, consultation with the different branches, to reach an agreement about who should succeed Zawahiri. Of course, it could be a combination of both aspects, but the fact is that over 2 months later, and we still don't really have a clue who's going to be al-Qaeda's new leader. That's not a sign of a healthy organization. Related to that, lots of people think that Saif al-Adl is supposed to be the obvious candidate. I don't think that this is really the case. While he was on the list of successors now for many, many years, and really reached the point where there is hardly anybody else left from the old guard, it is not clear that he can actually lead al-Qaeda. It depends on his condition in Iran. It depends on whether al-Qaeda operatives will actually trust him, given the long time that he spent in Iran. There is also the issue that Saif al-Adl always preferred to work behind the scenes. I'm not sure that Saif al-Adl is really that excited about coming to the forefront, especially since this is also tends to shorten your life significantly. So I'm not sure that Saif al-Adl is the obvious or the preferable choice for al-Qaeda and al-Qaeda cadre. It could be that al-Qaeda needs a new face in order to rejuvenate. But if it picks a new face, that would be a new source of problems. For example, al-Qaeda has very strong affiliates now in the Sahel and in Somalia. Would established branches or the leaders of established branches, some of them were mentioned as potential successors to Zawahiri, be happy with the elevation of somebody that was below them in the ranks beforehand, somebody that would bypass them? Could such a leader really fulfill his role meaningfully if he still stays in Afghanistan? Because remember, al-Qaeda has severe communication problems if it stays in Afghanistan. So if you have branches that will not be happy with a leader in Afghanistan, the leader in Afghanistan will have very little ability to exert any kind of control over them. On the other hand, if the successor will come from a branch of al-Qaeda, would other branches accept that a leader of a branch is elevated above them? Maybe they will be fearful that he would be biased towards his particular region and direct more resources there. Moreover, if he comes from a branch, would it be useful for al-Qaeda to even still be in Afghanistan? So a new leader might actually liberate al-Qaeda from the shackles of its allegiance to the Taliban and continue the shift that we've been seeing already since the beginning of the Arab uprisings, closer back into the Middle East. Now, al-Qaeda's early success stemmed from the ability to provide other group services, and this is central for the future of al-Qaeda, especially in Afghanistan. It provided services such as funding and training. The key question about the future of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and elsewhere is whether the group can continue to provide other actors with such benefits, whether they are formally affiliated or not. Enough benefits that will warrant close relations. And the acceptance of al-Qaeda's authority. Al-Qaeda was unique in the landscape of the jihadi movement during the 1990s, but it's no longer that unique. What helped it in the past to attract volunteers and relationships, those advantages, many of them are no longer there. There are other actors that can offer both transnational ideology and resources, training, fighting experience, funds. You don't need al-Qaeda for that. In fact, one could argue that perhaps there are Afghan or Pakistani groups that could be in a better position today to provide these kind of services. So it's not really clear how al-Qaeda reestablishes its comparative advantage to really grow independently in Afghanistan and Pakistan, rather than just being sort of behind the scene and trying to shape things. So how important is Afghanistan for al-Qaeda? I would say that operationally, it's not important at all. There are better places to plan and execute attacks from. And one can even argue that even pre-9/11, the real story was not Afghanistan, but the failure to take preparations, the failure to start the preparations in Germany and in the United States. Afghanistan and the region might have value for its legacy. And it is central to the ethos of al-Qaeda. It also has a value as a bastion of jihad because of the identification of the Taliban and jihad, and because of the opposition to the region's regime come from jihadi actors. I don't think that the Taliban is going to prevent the presence of jihadi actors, but it is likely to try to restrain them. I think that was the reason why they allowed Zawahiri to come back, but did not let al-Qaeda really operate openly from Afghanistan. And al-Qaeda was pretty clear that it's not going to plan any attacks from Afghanistan. I'm almost done. I would like to just say that al-Qaeda itself probably needs a serious rethinking of its goals and strategy. Fighting the United States seems just anachronistic at this point. And indeed, it is being slowly sidelined in the practices of al-Qaeda's branches, and effectively also by al-Qaeda Central. So to summarize, I think that al-Qaeda's role in Afghanistan is likely to further diminish. The risk to the international community from al-Qaeda's activities in Afghanistan is also pretty low. Afghan jihadism will still cause serious problems in South Asia, but it won't be a significant threat outside the region, especially compared to other closer jihadi arenas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was brilliant, and thank you very much, Barak. And I'm sure we'll come back to a lot of those points soon. That was Barak Mendelsohn, who is the author of Jihadism Constrained, the Limits of Transnational Jihadism and What It Means for Counterterrorism. I'm now going to invite Dr. Ashley Jackson, who is co-founder and co-director of the Center on Armed Groups, is research associate at ODI Global here in London, and at the Conflict, Security and Development Research Group that is at King's College London. Ashley has worked in Afghanistan for more than a decade and has published extensively on the Taliban, including very recently Negotiating Survival, Civilian-Insurgent Relations in Afghanistan, which was actually published earlier this year. Ashley, please speak now. You have about 8 minutes.
All right, thank you. And thank you for having me here. I've put together a couple of very loosely oriented points. I think I'll start by saying I agree with a lot of what Barak just said, and I'll try and build on that from the Afghanistan perspective. Having done a lot of work on the Taliban, jihad is not a term I use very much in my work on Afghanistan. I think the Taliban itself has, and Afghans themselves have a very different idea of jihad, and many, right? It's not singular, of course, but it very often has no transnational connotation, even for the Taliban. I think that's an important starting place to begin from. Jihad was about their struggle, their armed struggle specifically, and that was about two things: driving out international forces, which they can now claim that they effectively did, and establishing their vision of an Islamic government. What we've seen over the past year and a couple of months, there's a small problem there. They don't exactly agree on the specifics of what that Islamic government is. And we're seeing those differences in opinions and tensions play out in real time amid, of course, an economic collapse, a humanitarian crisis, and increasing international alienation, as well as other conflict actors strengthening, emerging, being incredibly resilient, but I'll come back to that in a second. All of which is to say that you need to begin with an understanding of the Taliban that acknowledges that they don't exactly agree on any number of issues, and whether or not they're giving safe haven to foreign jihadists, their relationships with other armed groups, any number of things, including girls' education, as we found out, they don't agree on. And that creates opportunities, but it also creates problems. If the Taliban were so inclined, which I don't think they are, to guarantee safety for other actors in their country, that's very precarious, right? They couldn't really make those guarantees. They couldn't protect Zawahiri. We've seen that. They put him in a place where he was extremely likely to be detected. If I were a jihadist seeking safe haven in Afghanistan, I wouldn't feel particularly safe. Not to say it doesn't provide opportunities as well, because there are these fractures and tensions and local loyalties and differences of opinions and opportunism to be gained from relationships with these actors. But it's complicated, right? There's no monolithic Taliban, and there's no monolithic kind of attitude towards this. Just again, building on what the previous panelist said, yes, we know that they're providing safe haven to certain groups, but it seems more on a personal basis. It seems also from a different frame of reference. There might be ideological sympathies, of course, the idea that these are Arab Mujahideen, these are our brothers, these kinds of things. But the drivers of that kind of support are premised on that these actors aren't going to orchestrate another 9/11, right? That they aren't going to jeopardize the Taliban's government. That might be naive on the Taliban's part, but they do have this idea of, we can control it, we can control it, we can balance all of these things. We can't expel these people, these brothers of ours, because of the loyalties that lie there and because of the image problems that the Taliban would face. But they're basically not assessing their own actions in the same way the rest of us, the outside world, does. And on top of that, I don't think they really care what most of the outside world thinks about these actions. I think what we've seen so far is that the Taliban, a lot of elements of the IEA government are, if not naive, a bit ignorant or unwise about the geopolitics of all these issues. There's also an incredible arrogance, which I think has been fueled by the fact that they effectively won, and this intransigence. And we've seen this again and again in the Taliban's dealings with the outside world. They miscalculate, they misinterpret, and I think that's where the real danger is if we talk about foreign groups seeking safe haven in Afghanistan, and that's a much more complicated danger to deal with. For example, in the Doha talks, they were talking about listed individuals associated with al-Qaeda and other groups behind closed doors, I think, as refugees, as old men, harmless. So when you're dealing with that kind of standpoint, which maybe is disingenuous, but again, that's an interesting argument to make in the context of those talks. So where does that leave us? Well, I think two things are interesting about the future of jihad in Afghanistan. And one is the way that the Taliban's victory has been viewed by other Islamist or Salafi jihadist armed groups. I think you have groups like HTS in Syria and analysts at the Crisis Group and elsewhere have done some work on this, analyzing how they see Taliban victory as a pathway to political legitimacy for themselves. They're trying to make the argument, well, if you engage with the Taliban in talks, surely you should engage with us. Surely we can be a legitimate actor. So some groups, even ones like HTS who had former pretty hardcore affiliations, have moved on and see this as a potential model, not just the military victory, but the talks. There are others like TTP, who I think they're very nervous by the Taliban's engagement in talks. Don't leave us behind once you become a government. Don't, abandon us. We helped you. You should help us. And you've seen that reflected in the Taliban's, the IEA is trying to act as an interlocutor with the Pakistan government in peace talks or in some kinds of talks between the TTP and the government. At the same time, groups like al-Shabaab have, I think, been really threatened by Taliban engaging in talks, have been encouraged by their victory. But it is now a precedent. And I think what's interesting to see is how groups then learn from that, because they all learn from each other and model on that. The last point I'll make, which is the most important, is how is the Taliban going to deal with jihadist groups on its territory? Islamic State Khorasan, which Antonio and others I'm sure can speak with more authority, but that is the rival group to the Taliban. And there have been sustained attacks by ISK since the IEA took over. They have claimed several serious cross-border attacks, which is another issue around the IEA's ability to maintain its territorial sovereignty. There have been, of course, we talked about this in the introduction, several horrific high-profile attacks. The recent one at the school that killed at least 50 people and wounded 100 more. And it continues. And there's no real indication that the IEA government is able to rein this in. They've brutally gone after anyone they suspect of being affiliated with ISK, particularly singling out Salafist scholars and religious officials. We saw this when the body of a respected scholar, Mujahid was left on the roadside, I think either beheaded or just deeply mutilated, and many other figures where the Taliban is trying to make an example out of tribal elders, people who they just suspect, even people who are political rivals affiliated with Hezbollah Islami, Qubadin, and others. And yet the attacks still continue. So I think the future of jihadism is not only a question of foreign jihadism, it's of groups like ISK. Who do they attract to Afghanistan? What kind of alliances do they make, and how do they fit into this South Asian landscape of groups? So to summarize, I agree with many points that have already been made, but hopefully I've made a contribution fleshing out some of the bigger questions. Unfortunately, having worked on Afghanistan for a while, not as long as others on this panel, I refuse to make predictions about the future of anything. So I refuse to answer the question really of what is the future of jihadism in Afghanistan, because right now it could go in any number of directions. There are a lot of pathways that I see that are very clear and very uncertain, both with al-Qaeda, but also with the IEA and ISK. But I will leave it there and hand it back to Neil and John. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashley. And that's absolutely fine if you don't want to make a prediction now. We will come back to you in about 10-15 minutes and ask for a prediction. But thank you very much. That was Ashley Jackson, who is author of Negotiating Survival, Civilian-Insurgent Relations in Afghanistan, which was published earlier this year. I am now going to introduce once again, for the benefit of those members of the audience who've joined since we started the event, Ali Mohammad Ali, who is an independent consultant and researcher. From 2018 to 2021, Ali was Director General of Strategic Intelligence for the National Security Council of Afghanistan. Ali has expertise on radical Islamist groups like the Taliban, the al-Qaeda in South Asia, the ISIS-Khorasan, drug trafficking and money laundering networks, Afghanistan's politics, economy, and the state, as well as Iran's and Pakistan's use of non-state actors in foreign policy. Once Ali has finished, Antonio will take over once again, and we will begin the discussion. But for the moment, Ali, please speak. You have about 8 minutes.
Hi. After the Taliban takeover, Afghanistan certainly entered a new era of socioeconomic and geopolitical challenges. In particular, the Taliban's inability to exercise control over the country's territory has created a power vacuum that multiple jihadist groups are rushing to fill faster than ever. Before we began a conversation about what the future of jihadism looks like in Afghanistan, we must first examine the current makeup of and relations among the jihadist groups across Afghanistan and their relationship with the Taliban. And B, we need to take a look at the root causes of jihadism, both in terms of indoctrination and recruitment and other factors. I'll mention a few key aspects of both now. I will then look forward to delving into what now questions with the other panel members and with all during the discussions. What we look at when we look at jihadism in Afghanistan, I see three distinct layers of organization of jihadist groups that operate in the country. These layers are global, regional, and local. While the degree to which these groups prioritize one aspect or another in their call to action differs, most of them tend to pursue a hybrid goal that couples religious interests with criminal ones, including drug trafficking and illegal mining. Starting with the top layer, that is with the global jihadist groups that have established an actual stronghold in Afghanistan. We have the Islamic State and al-Qaeda that operates throughout the country, working on strategies to inflict harm wherever possible, particularly on the European and American continent. Islamic State Khorasan branch has had a complicated relationship with the Taliban over the years. Their interests used to largely overlap. With the Islamic State assuming responsibility for the Taliban attacks, that is no longer the case. As the Taliban is leaving an increasingly power vacuum in Afghanistan, the Islamic State has been recruiting and targeting the Taliban and siphoning the Taliban's profits stemming from illegal mining and drug trafficking. The al-Qaeda-Taliban relationship is deeply intertwined and goes back to the era of Afghan jihad against the Russians. Since the 90s, the Taliban and al-Qaeda relationship has become increasingly symbiotic, with al-Qaeda providing funding, training, and conducting operations on behalf of the Taliban. This relationship is stronger than ever, as exemplified by al-Zawahiri's presence in Saraj Haqqani's guest house. Now let's look at the middle layer, the one a number of jihadist groups with Pakistani, Uzbek, Tajik, Kyrgyz, and other backgrounds are using Afghanistan as a base to target South and Central Asian countries. The Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, led by Qari Hikmat Yoldash, actually the son of Qari Yoldash or Aziz Yoldash, and Katiba Imam Bukhari or Jamaat Imam Bukhari, led by Ubaidullah Muradullah, are actively engaged in jihadist activities to target Central Asian countries. We saw in recent months the Islamists causing unrest in Central Asia, with affected governments directly blaming the jihadists active in Afghanistan. And finally, we have moved to the third layer of jihadism, the local ones. In contrast to other two layers, the Afghanistan-born organizations such as the Jamiat-e-Islah, Hizb ut-Tahrir, the franchise of Hizb ut-Tahrir Global is purely run by local Afghans. Islah and Tahrir adhere to the ideology of militant jihadism, but do not have a military apparatus like the Taliban or other jihadist groups. The aforementioned two groups operate out of Peshawar in Pakistan and mainly aim to indoctrinate the students in high schools and Afghan universities. The Taliban have banned Jamiat-e-Islah and Hizb ut-Tahrir because of the organization's Salafist ideology and the fact that most of the student recruits end up joining the Islamic State Khorasan. Having seen the permutation of jihadist organizations in Afghanistan, you are right to ask why Afghanistan and why now. Afghanistan, since the Cold War and during the War on Terror, has been the target of states and non-state actors and has been left alone to the jihadists twice. Once after the withdrawal of Russian troops, and second after the withdrawal of NATO troops. In concluding for now, I want to underscore the majority of the global jihad, global, regional, and local jihadists in Afghanistan have been here to assisted by the Taliban and are now intending to get the Taliban's assistance, or at the very least, to have the Taliban to turn a blind eye to their activities. We cannot forget that the largest jihadist group in the world is the Taliban, and their intentions are clear in their actions, as well as their insistence on being known as the ultimate jihadist. I know the situation is complex and the sheer numbers of various jihadist groups are constantly increasing, so I'm looking forward to the discussion phase and a more in-depth conversation. I especially look forward to hearing and evaluating strategies to diminish, if not eliminate, the drivers of jihadist indoctrination in Afghanistan that has led and continues to lead violence at global, regional, and local level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ali. That was a very, very interesting contribution to what Barak and Ashley have said. We've started getting some questions. Thank you very much to the audience for sending them. Since no name is mentioned in the question I see in front of me, I'm assuming it is for the panel. So I will pose it in the panel later on. But if it is, I just wanted to remind members of the audience that if it is for a particular member of the panel, please do mention them by name. I'm now going to introduce once again Dr. Antonio Giustozzi, who is visiting fellow the LSE South Asia Center, our center, and an independent researcher and analyst with a special interest in conflicts, wars, security, and strategic issues in Afghanistan and the region. Antonio is also a senior visiting fellow at RUSI. He has published extensively on the subject, including most recently The Taliban at War, 2001 to 2021, and following from what Barak said at the beginning of his comments, we now know there's another book that's in the making and coming our way. Antonio.
Thank you very much. And so we'll start with some remarks of my own, which anyway link to what the panelists have been saying. I think that looking at the issue of jihadism in Afghanistan in particular, but in general, in black and white terms, is not useful, certainly not useful for us who have to analyze what's going on as opposed to wage a propaganda war. And I think we should shift the debate towards a more, if you like, a political economy understanding of jihadism, including in Afghanistan. And it's obvious that events like, for example, the killing of al-Zawahiri are going to have an impact in terms of even the calculation that the different organizations are doing on the ground, including al-Qaeda. And of course, it's difficult to establish exactly what al-Qaeda is thinking now or that strike. We try to understand, but of course, the evidence is always very fragmentary because the very nature of course, underground organizations. But we do understand that that, of course, was unexpected because they wouldn't have moved al-Zawahiri to Kabul in the expectation they would be getting killed there. Clearly, they trusted their country to protect him. Their countries failed. So that's the first point. I think that definitely, I believe, is going to shake the faith of al-Qaeda in their countries, which they say now they had entrusted the security, the safety to, so that, you know, all the leaders, all the cadre of al-Qaeda are actually moving under the protection of, moving out of Afghanistan under the protection of their countries. And now, of course, they probably have doubts about whether their countries can protect them or not. I'm not going to discuss in detail these rumors, which probably are more than rumors circulating about further drone strikes that took place in the following weeks, one of which at least killed a rather senior al-Qaeda operative from Egypt, because they're not confirmed. Probably they might never be confirmed, so I'm not going to speculate on that. But if they are true, of course, they would add a further dimension of distrust between even al-Qaeda and their countries, despite the fact that al-Qaeda does see their countries as the most trustworthy among the Taliban. And then, of course, there are certainly, you know, from what you can gather from sources within al-Qaeda, and of course, you cannot speak to the very senior people there at all, they do think, many of them do think that some people within the Taliban helped the Americans track down al-Zawahiri and essentially kill him. Now, that might be true or not, but the point that if they do think so, that adds a further important layer of distrust, because of course, thinking of Afghanistan as a safe haven, if you think that some of the people in government are actually helping the American tracking down your members, then probably you can look for a better safe haven somewhere else. You know, at that point, the comparative advantage of Afghanistan essentially disappeared, especially now they have to choose a new leader. And of course, again, you know, perhaps it's not wise to speculate who the leader could be, but perhaps that leader, if he's not in Afghanistan, may not feel that he needs to go there at this point, you know, that the country doesn't offer particular guarantees of safety anymore. I think it's important what Ashley raised the issue of Ayatollah Sham in Syria, not only because Ayatollah Sham does see the Taliban now as an example of, if you like, or another example, because of course they see themselves as the first example, but as another example of deglobalized jihadism, you know, stressing the national dimension of jihadism, Syrian jihad, Afghan jihad, not global jihad. Of course, they're vested interest in doing that, and you know they're facing a complex and long, I suppose, struggle for self-legitimization. But I think the other important dimension about this is, again, if you try to think in terms of what our al-Qaeda leaders see what's going on in Afghanistan. I think it's essentially unthinkable they might not have Ayatollah Sham al-Nusra in their mind, because of course, for them, that was the biggest defeat in their history, was the biggest hope at one point. Al-Nusra, when al-Nusra was growing, was expanding, was becoming the success story for al-Qaeda, also in terms of fundraising, because of course, al-Qaeda has to raise constantly funding around the world to maintain also its role as the redistributor of funding for jihad. So means that first of all, you need to go to prospective donors and convince them to open their wallet, which anybody who raise funds for research knows how difficult it is. So even, I suppose, raising funds for jihad must be hard. That was very important for them. They were raising more money than ever. I mean, of course, you could say Al-Shabaab in Somalia is a success story for them. JNIM in Mali is a success story. But in terms of fundraising, al-Nusra was on a different scale. In the Gulf, that was seen as the guerre célèbre par excellence from 2011 onwards. So raising money for Syria was very easy and very successful. And then we know it ended. It's not only the war has been essentially lost, but the most important thing, al-Nusra betrayed al-Qaeda, and that ends up not only separating from al-Qaeda, but of course turning against al-Qaeda eventually, not immediately, it was a process, but turning against it, and clearly, essentially in the eyes of al-Qaeda, helping the Americans target al-Qaeda operatives in Syria. And that's definitely what they say in public. Al-Qaeda accuses Ayatollah Sham of tipping off the Americans about the location of their own members. And I think that's not unrealistic to assume that some collaboration does take place, given the accuracy of these strikes and the fact that they never hit at Ayatollah Sham even by mistake. So whatever the case, I'm discussing what probably al-Qaeda thinks at this point. So I think it's inevitable that we start looking at the Taliban through the prism of Syria. Whatever, of course, the future cannot by definition be really predicted, but certainly they must have the example of Syria there in front of them. And they must be thinking, it's not that these guys are going to do to us what Ayatollah Sham did to us in Syria. And of course, al-Dawi himself, from the Abbottabad papers, we know he had already back, in those years when bin Laden was still alive, a reservation, very strong reservation about Taliban leaders, not all of them, but of course, those leaders included Baradar, and also included Akhtar Mansour, and Abatullah was, the dolphin of Akhtar Mansour when he was alive. So although it's not mentioned in the paper because it was not such a big leader at that point, but it belongs, if you like, to the Mansour family, if you like. It comes from there politically, and so probably is also covered by those doubts that the leaders of al-Qaeda, bin Laden himself, had about them. That was back then, and of course, a lot of things have happened. The agreements with the Americans, which essentially has collapsed, but nonetheless, clearly must have raised some questions in al-Qaeda. Most importantly, the strikes and the failure, at least of the Taliban, to provide security. So, of course, al-Qaeda is only one of the two main global jihadist organizations in Afghanistan. The Islamic State is a different story. I think, I would agree with Barak that for al-Qaeda now, Afghanistan probably will be of declining importance because they don't have al-Zawahiri to protect anymore. There are limited options. Once he was in Pakistan, where could he go? Either Pakistan or Afghanistan. And Pakistan seemed to be more and more problematic in recent times. And then I guess one of the reasons why this issue with the Taliban might have arisen is because he had to move into Afghanistan. He was also, I understand, quite sick. That was confirmed by al-Qaeda sources. So, of course, living in the mountains on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, probably if you are seriously sick, is not a great option. There might also be a reason for moving him to Kabul, because we don't know for sure, but he's gone. So one reason for having a safe haven in Afghanistan now might not be there. Doesn't mean that al-Qaeda will abandon Afghanistan completely, but I think the idea of turning it again in headquarters for al-Qaeda is probably not a good idea at this point. It seems the security, the safety of the leadership will not be guaranteed there. But the Islamic State is different because, of course, the options available to the Islamic State in general are limited in terms of expansion, in terms of trying to raise the head of the caliphate again. Afghanistan at this point looks quite promising, despite a lot of issues that they have, a lot of problems they're having, simply because, as Ali pointed out, it's definitely quite chaotic. It's not unusual. I mean, of course, when you have a change of regime, especially a violent change of regime, you're going to have certainly a very complex transition. If you remember, like Afghanistan was looking like in 2001, 2, 3, I wasn't going around the country then. It was, quite messy. Of course, there was no armed opposition, big advantage, but I was going to police station at that time. It was completely dysfunctional. It was even worse than the Taliban now. So this chaos is to be expected. The Taliban, of course, are not helping themselves by essentially being very difficult with all their potential international interlocutors within the region and beyond. And that is compounding their problems. But from the point of view of the Islamic State, what matters is that the Taliban have little money to organize a state, little expertise, and are facing growing opposition from a range of sources, not only the Islamic State, which compounds their problems in terms of controlling the territory and in terms of basically mounting a consistent, coherent, and effective counterinsurgency to crush the Islamic State. The Islamic State is not very strong, but relative to the current chaos in Afghanistan, the current inability of the Taliban even to organize a decision-making in an efficient way, they probably think reasonably, I would say, to have some chances, that they see some potential there. The potential is not to take Kabul and turn it into the new caliphate, the new center of the caliphate, but state collapse, I think, is something that the Islamic State in Khorasan could reasonably contribute to achieving, together with the Taliban and their own mistakes, but also other opposition forces. You don't need to have a formal alliance to converge towards the same aim, which is to achieve state collapse, in which, of course, means that the Islamic State will become one faction among many. And at that point, they could even expand their hold, because actually they're the strongest and best organized of the different opposition groups right now. Probably they will be for quite some time to go. So in the context of chaos, state collapse, they would have an edge. Doesn't mean they can take the entire country, but they could consolidate control over parts of the country, have a established safe haven. So I think it's a realistic or relatively realistic plan, which probably is not matched by a lot of other better opportunities somewhere else. It's not that there are a lot of places where the Islamic State has a great prospects right now. So I would say, just to summarize, I see the Islamic State having better prospects in Afghanistan than al-Qaeda for sure. And of course, it's a matter of how they play their cards, how the enemies play their cards, the Taliban, but also the country, the region, and beyond the region, what they can do realistically to preempt the Islamic State is difficult, because none of them wants to be closely associated with the Taliban, of course, and not clear that the Taliban want to be closely associated with any of them. They would probably welcome money, cash, or supplies, but they don't want to make any compromises for that. So it's actually difficult for anybody to cooperate with them. And I understand there is growing worry in the region about the prospects of state collapse, because they see the Taliban as not being able to formulate policies in a coherent way, because of the internal division that actually highlighted, and also because probably the mindset, the political culture, the lack of experience don't help in that direction. So I think I would stop here with my remarks, because I'm speaking too much, and perhaps is the right time to insert some questions, Nirjan. What do you think?
Why don't you go ahead with the discussion? I can pose the question since you've mentioned it. There is a question which is, I'll just read the question directly. It's for all of you, so all of you can take turns in answering it, please. And keep your answers brief so we can take others. We don't have another question at the moment, but if others come in, otherwise you can carry on the discussion amongst yourself. The question is this: what is the future of jihadism in broader Central Asia, given targeting recently, for example, in neighboring Tajikistan? And it's for all of you. So shall we just go backwards? Ali, do you want to speak first, then Ashley, and then Barak, and then Antonio?
Well, I think it's a very complicated phenomenon, in my opinion, and I have a feeling that Afghanistan, particularly northern Afghanistan, is a time bomb, and what will happen to Central Asia, it's going to be bad. It depends how the Central Asians are prepared for the Islamist uprising emanating from Afghanistan. But certainly, like we saw that just recently, how the guy whose name is Mehdi Arsalan, the Tajik guy who just established the Taliban in Tajikistan. And he, if somebody sent me a picture of his command, he's just by the Amu River. There is a huge stone. They have written Tehrik-e-Taliban Tajikistan, and it is in front of the Amu River that faces Tajikistan, so they can see. So we do have all the potential, and we see that a lot of al-Qaeda activities in northern Afghanistan and Islamic State activities, and their main goal is to enable these groups, the groups like Jamaat Imam Bukhari, who most of the fighters have come back from Syria, and they're tactically very advanced. They're very good in using all the warfare tactics, and they're pretty good and technologically savvy, particularly when it comes to using the cyberspace to indoctrinate or wage jihad in those countries. But I do see a potential of destabilization in Central Asia, not only Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, but we have to see how prepared the states are, and we see how the Taliban will deal with these groups, because there is one very important distinction that we have to make, is that the Taliban in Kandahar, in Kabul, has very different relationship with the Taliban in the field, the Taliban commanders, particularly the Taliban commanders in the north, and the Uzbek Talibans there. They're all like close to the IMU people, the people with different jihadist groups that operate from the north. And then you have the Tajik ones and the other nationalities. We have Kazakhs and Kyrgyz, and even we have Russians, the Tatars and Dagestanis and Chechens. And Afghanistan's northern Afghanistan is in particularly one of I always call it a time bomb. So any rebellion against the Taliban would happen in the next couple of months that would start from the north, as it happened against the Afghan Republic. We saw that the northwestern Afghanistan and the northeastern Afghanistan, all the provinces and districts fell just like this, squeezed all into the north, and they came down, and then it started from central Afghanistan and even the last weeks of August, the things started to change in the south and in the western Afghanistan. So I do see the northern Afghanistan a serious threat to Central Asia, and I don't see any ability from the Taliban's leadership in Kandahar and Kandahar and Kabul to manage or control, even though I have seen, like, after the rocket attacks and after the couple of attacks against Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, I did see some silence on the part of the jihadist groups. I did not see any violence against the jihadist groups. It's probably a marriage of convenience. The Taliban might have asked them to please do not attack those countries because it will definitely or seriously harm our the process of legitimization of the Taliban regime. Thank you.
Sorry, Ashley, you just want to go ahead? Yeah.
Yeah. I think what Ali said is really helpful, and just building on that, I think 2 or 3 points. You know, the lack of US or foreign troops in Afghanistan, which acted as a magnet for so much outrage, is now gone, right? So one of the kind of causes of jihad, or one of the narrative devices and the kind of rallying cries, they're gone. So that is one aspect which might be in favor of there not being as much of the same kinds of narrative and political dynamics around attraction to jihad and recruitment. However, I think you've seen a shift to all jihad being local, even al-Qaeda being localized, finding these local networks and embedding, and being more decentralized and fractured, which goes along with the way the rest of the world is going and how we're kind of entering this multipolar environment where there aren't the kind of great power coalitions like NATO to keep things in check and all these kinds of things. All of which is to say, I very much agree with Ali's comments about the north of Afghanistan being a time bomb. We really have to watch and see how the Taliban manages its crises. It's been muddling through with an astounding level of success somehow. It's catastrophic. This is not to say that they're doing well, but things haven't fallen apart yet. At some point, they will have a real crisis that threatens their control and legitimacy. And it feels like until that happens, we're in a holding pattern. And when that happens, then Afghanistan, they won't be able to say to their neighbors or to neighboring groups, you know, please quiet down for our sake. They won't be able to exert influence over these groups. There'll be much more factionalization and proxy fighting, which brings me to my last point. It really also depends on what China, India, others do about what's happening in Afghanistan and in its neighboring countries. You won't have the US or European countries intervening. You won't have, but it is of concern to China, right? And I think we've failed to really see how neighboring countries and how great powers in the region or bigger powers in the region, what their strategy is for the Taliban. I think it feels like a wing and a prayer that hopefully things won't get worse. But I don't think that's sustainable, and a lot will rest on how they react. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
I think it.
Ashley, I think you've muted yourself suddenly.
Oh no, I finished. So I sorry.
Oh, I see. Oh, I see. Sorry. Okay. Barak.
So I would separate the threat of attacks from a threat to the stability of regimes in Central Asia. I think that the current circumstances make it more likely that we will see more jihadi attacks from across the border, perhaps even in main cities. But I still don't see how this really changes the level of control of those autocratic regimes in Central Asia. The way that stability can be eroded is mostly a matter of how states decide to respond to these kind of activities. By the way, I think there is a lot more likelihood of jihadi damage in Pakistan than you will have in Central Asia. And to repeat what people before me said, the Taliban is having control problems. If there are actors in the north that decide that they want to carry out attacks, especially if they are Taliban elements, it's going to be hard for the Taliban to fully stop them. It's definitely going to be hard for the Taliban to stop other groups from carrying out these kind of attacks. We should also keep in mind that the Taliban, I see a lot of the violent events in Afghanistan or from Afghanistan as just part of a bargaining process. For the Taliban, to see other actors threatening neighboring states is a risky option, but it could also be beneficial. The Taliban can this way try to create leverage where they can remove support or they can repress those that are trying to attack regimes in Central Asia in return for something that they would need. As I said, of course, this is a little bit problematic. One, you don't really know for sure the level of control that Taliban has, Taliban from Kabul over what's going on in the north. That's going to be a problem. And the second is there is a risk that you might overshoot, in that the Taliban would lead to produce an overreaction by neighboring states that will undermine the Taliban's fragile control over the region. Now, I also expect to see more of that kind of violence, not necessarily from the Taliban, but because ISK has an interest in triggering interstate conflict. And so if we think about terrorism as a mode of provocation, then ISQ might decide that attacking in Central Asian countries from Afghanistan might have benefits beyond their intrinsic interest in those Central Asian countries, in that it forces the Taliban into an inconvenient position where it either take action against the jihadis, and then it might reduce the conflict that it has with Central Asian countries, but it will then be blamed as cooperating with those heretics against the Muslims. And so I can see ISK using that, and perhaps other groups using that as a tool against the Taliban. And so the domestic politics of Afghanistan might spill over and increase incentives for violence in Central Asia. And of course, actors tend to have misperceptions. And it could be that some jihadi groups from the region would feel more motivated these days, thinking that due to the weakness that Russia is revealing in the Ukraine, the ability of foreign actors to actually help Central Asian regimes is going to be more limited. Perhaps jihadis would think that this is a good opportunity, and therefore there is an increased risk that you will see this kind of conflict. But whether it actually becomes a meaningful or wide-scale conflict, a lot depends on the ability of Central Asian countries to show resilience, which means showing restraint in this case.
I think it's my turn. I think I would agree with Barak that so far, so at this stage, the attacks that are taking place across the border, at least in part, were conceived as, if you like, provocations in the hope that the local regimes would overreact, as they tend to do. You know, they tend to be quite, especially the Tajik one these days, but in general, quite overreactive to any kind of threats. And indeed, they took it very seriously. They had this display of force on the border, flying helicopters and planes over it. And then they hear from Taliban sources, they actually complain very loud, especially after the second attack on Uzbekistan. At the diplomatic level, there was quite a bit of, very harsh exchanges there. And of course, we don't know what they do internally, but probably they would also tighten police controls. And I think there is a sense in Uzbekistan that, because of the lack of any open political dynamics, it's difficult to assess really what's going on. But there is a sense of this resurgence of Islam in terms of practice, but perhaps also in terms of political Islam, is alleged by many people. That in practice, it's very difficult to know what's going on, what people think, because they're not going to say in public, what they feel. But there is a sense of that. I think personally, there's another dimension to these attacks, and the way the Islamic State works is, it's a bit like an NGO, though NGOs will not like this comparison, I think. But, they have a portfolio of projects, they need to do fundraising. And right now, but I don't know exactly at the global level, but they're having a lot of problems, the Islamic State in Khorasan, in transferring funds to Afghanistan and Pakistan, because their main financial hub in Turkey is under very heavy pressure. The Turkish authorities in recent months have been cracking down on Islamic State networks, not only Khorasan in general, but of course, Islamic State in Khorasan is also affected. It's more difficult, not impossible, but more difficult, more riskier to transfer money from there. So they reduce the volume. Some properties and assets have been frozen or seized. They try to reactivate similar network that used to be operational some years ago in the United Arab Emirates. There was an immediate crackdown from the authorities there as well. People were arrested. So right now that was completely blocked. There is apparently no flow of funds from Dubai and from the Emirates in general. So that complicates the matters considerably. So even if they have technically money and reserve in Turkey, they cannot transfer as much as they would like of it to the operational ground in Afghanistan. And they are trying to diversify. So we hear of emissaries going to the traditional donors in Saudi Arabia, in Bahrain, in Kuwait, in the Gulf countries, knocking the door of various sheikhs asking for money, but they don't seem to be very successful. There is some money coming from Saudi Arabia apparently, but in general, the kind of interest in sponsoring the Islamic State in Khorasan has gone down, because nobody wants to pay for a jihad against the Taliban. In the Gulf, say the Taliban is not really the kind of target we want to spend our money on. So that's why the Islamic State tries to argue that, okay, you don't want to pay for the jihad against the Taliban. What about Central Asia? And then they start trying to show that the capacity, they can do things, they're willing to do things. And of course, they overstate their capabilities, because I don't think they have right now a lot of capabilities, but they're trying to raise money on that account. I understand, and it's very difficult, of course, to make a precise assessment, but they don't seem to be very successful on that either, because even on that in the Gulf, there's not much interest now for jihad in Central Asia. It's not like during the peak of the Syrian war. That was different. Now Russia is not seen as an enemy. Syria is already the past. And geopolitically, actually, Russia is quite an ally now for the many of the Gulf states, as you've seen from the recent OPEC decision to cut the output of oil. Of course, not for reason anything to do with Afghanistan. It's a completely different, if you like, dimension. But doesn't matter. There is certainly at the state level, there's no interest in helping or fostering right now a jihad in Central Asia or hurting Russia or whatever. Of course, there will be some individual sheikhs that will have their own agenda and whatever. But the fact is that for the sheikhs in Saudi Arabia to go against the interest of the state is not that easy. It's risky. Yeah, so it might be private money, but the boundary between private and state in Saudi Arabia is always very a bit dodgy, let's say. So I think there is an intent, and I think they are right. The Islamic State is right in assessing that there is potential there are possibilities, but it has to work harder to find the money. We do understand from police and intelligence sources that for the first time, the Islamic State is doing fundraising in Europe now, directly bypassing the caliphate, essentially, which normally has a tight control of fundraising beyond the region. So not at the local level, but at the wider level. So now they have their own direct funding, not only because of these arrests that took place in Afghanistan recently, but we hear from Europe, from sources in Europe, that they detect fundraising efforts. And I think they can raise many millions there, but I take it as a sign of difficulty of the Islamic State that has to, for the first time, to do grassroots fundraising because they don't have enough money. So I think the potential is there, but they have a number of difficulties. But I think it's right to assess the situation as a time bomb, and it might explode or not, but it's certainly not reassuring that you have this thing ticking under your pillow, and the situation could change anytime. It could be that at some point, for whatever reason, somebody decides to make some money available. Perhaps they resolve the issues in Turkey. They find a way to transfer the money. Now, cryptocurrency is being used quite a lot by the Islamic State in Khorasan as well, So there are all these kind of developments that are very difficult to control. And I would agree with, what everybody else said, that the situation in the north is very critical. And the real problem, I don't even think the Taliban understand, they deny the existence of ethnic issues in Afghanistan, a bit like many Afghan politicians before them, and don't even understand why Uzbek Taliban or Tajik Taliban have issues with the Taliban leadership. And that's the most worrying thing, because if you don't understand that there are issues, you're not going to probably be able to resolve that. I actually wanted to raise an issue to discuss within the panel, because probably some people, I don't know exactly who is listening to us, but some people who listen to us might be wondering at this point, what kind of policies could be put in place by Western governments. Of course, when we talk about Western governments, first and foremost, United States of America, because the others are small players in comparison. But what kind of policies could be in place to kind of improve the situation? Some people argue, and I think there is no evidence of this, and there won't be for quite some time, because unless there are leaks by some American officials to journalists or whatever, but some people argue that there is actually a policy in place to kind of, if you like, again, like in the past, try to divide or split the Taliban between, say, the pragmatists with whom you can kind of reach some kind of understanding, and the hardliners. And that perhaps this strikes, like not so much perhaps that there is a strike, but the other strike which are alleged to have happened, but they're not confirmed, could be an indication of that, that these strikes have the intent of polarizing, if you like, the Taliban. And if you see the reaction to the Al-Dawari strike, with the Afghans demonstrating in the streets, organizing, demonstration in their turfs, and the Kandahar Taliban not reacting at all and being quite mild in their reaction, actually even at diplomatic level, might highlight that perhaps there is some potential there. But I wonder what the other panelists think about this.
Okay, I'm just going to come in here briefly because there's another question. Please do respond to what Antonio has said as well, but we are beginning to run short of time now. So if you could keep your responses brief. I'll read out the question and you can answer together along with your responses to the points that Antonio raised, and he did raise quite a few. The question actually has a moral undertone to it, which is interesting. I'm going to read it out to you, which is the implicit acceptance of the IEA, that's the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, for those who may not get it immediately, in place of the Afghan people and state, and the dismissal of the resistance, within brackets Ahmad Massoud, as an quote-unquote opposition group on par with ISIS-Khorasan, not a huge disservice to the people of Afghanistan. So to turn the whole thing on its head, the question is the assumption of the acceptance of the IEA. Is this not doing a huge disservice to the forces that are opposing the IEA, as well as the people of Afghanistan, which is very much one of the latent themes on which this entire discussion has happened? So that's a question from a member of the audience. So if you could just keep your responses brief. Should we go the other way now? Barak, do you want to speak first, then Ashley, then Ali? Antonio, you'll have the last word.
Thank you. There's not much I can say about that, especially the moral question. It's always a matter of balance. It's not that you have one good choice and one bad one, and you just pick the easy one. You're picking between basically really bad choices. And so some recognition of the Taliban could help in moderate the Taliban. On the other hand, the person that asked is perfectly right. There is also some kind of betrayal of the Afghan public. But if you look from international relations perspective, we need to be more modest in our ability to, how we think about our ability to shape events in particular countries. And I guess that goes into the question that Antonio raised. And if there is anything the last 20 years should have taught us, is to be extremely modest in the use of foreign intervention. It's very unfortunate because, you know, we still remember happier times when we thought that interventions could be successful, could make the world a better place, a more just place. But at this point, it seems that this is not really the case. The damage of an external intervention, even if it's not violent, could outweigh the benefits that it gives. But if you provide only assistance to Afghanistan to be able to alleviate poverty, at the same time you are giving the Taliban extra ability to control. So I'm really uncertain. It's not that there is one policy that I see as really good chances of success. So I would let first the actors in the region figure out what they want to do, and especially for the West, there are so many other more urgent issues that the West needs to deal with, and the West so far has not shown that it has any advantage over any other actor in how to deal with Afghanistan. So I just don't see a good justification for changing that now.
Yeah, maybe if I can quickly come in, I agree with all of that again. But I think to Antonio's point, the US and wider Western countries who withdrew from Afghanistan, I don't think they have a clear objective in Afghanistan. I don't think they know what they want. I don't think they have a vision of what success looks like in this framework, of what the least bad outcome looks like even. And that means, quite obviously, they don't have a strategy. And that becomes really difficult. I think this over the horizon capacity, this being able to still bomb targets inside Afghanistan or along the border, was this way of saying, look, we'll still be able to get bad guys whilst they negotiated their way out of the country. And now it just feels slightly cynical, like what the US does when it doesn't want to get engaged and doesn't know what else to do. Yeah, so it's not that, but I think to even begin to think about the policies that would work or be desirable, we have to actually know what the outcome one is striving for is, and they don't know that. And on the audience question, absolutely, I don't think anyone here, I would not to speak on behalf of the panel, but certainly myself, no one's assuming, or I'm not assuming that the Taliban has been endorsed by the Afghan people. It's quite the opposite. And I think as time has gone on, that's become more the case. And I don't think these conversations should imply that the Taliban is somehow legitimate, whatever that might mean, but that they are the ones in this stage of the conflict, which is not over, have the de facto monopoly on violence. I think that is the best way to sort of describe them. They are the de facto governments. The conflict itself is, as the the audience member says is still playing out. But I'll stop there and hand it over to, I think, Ali or Antonio. I'm not sure who goes next.
Ali. Yeah, thank you very much. I agree completely with most of what Ashley have said, but I want to come on the policy of polarization in particular. I think that the West, or probably the United States, like from what I know, from what I talk to people here in Washington, I don't think there is any policy and clarity as Ashley said it. I think the Taliban polarization is very natural, and the way they act, the way they behave is completely their own policy, is something that they have, they love to do it. It's exactly what we saw in the 90s. It's a deja vu for most Afghans. After the withdrawal of foreign troops, Russian troops from Afghanistan in the 1989, and the subsequent collapse of the Najib government, the Mujahideen came, and instead of building a government, they turn into each other. They destroy the country, destroy the government, demolish everything. And in the same process, after the withdrawal of American troops, we see the same pattern coming out. It is the way that the Taliban are acting and behaving is not something the Americans have asked them to ban schools, girls from schools. The Americans or the European countries have not asked them to do things that are not, that is diminishing your popular support. So there are a lot of things that we see that what the Taliban are doing is not as a result of the policy or the efforts of Western countries to polarize the Taliban. They already all are polarized, the Kandaharis versus the Ghalgis, and they all have come and have married new wives and has all these houses, all the, like, buying villas in Dubai, and now they're thinking to go to Istanbul to get all that. So it's a kind of, like, you know, after defeat after success, and we see that the Taliban, they're not ready to govern. They don't want to. You see that all Ministry of Health is filled with mullahs. Positions, technical positions are being filled by mullahs. The agriculture, the finance, everything. So the Taliban, they have sidelined all the technocrats, all the technical people. After August 15, 2021, a lot of Afghans I spoke to were willing to go and serve and work for the Taliban. And when they went there, they stayed in Afghanistan, they left the country disappointed. They said these people are not willing to govern. And what is happening now is, like the Mujahideen, like the Taliban filled the vacuum Mujahideen created after the collapse of Dr. Najibullah regime, the Islamic State is filling the vacuum the Taliban has created. And it is exactly, it may not be exactly the same, but to me, the number of recruitments, the fact that Islamic State is finding breeding ground in Afghanistan is quite surprising. It's unlike Syria and Iraq. We don't have sectarianism, but still you have all these factions, and it is because, as a result of Taliban's policies. We see that Imam al-Zawahiri, they signed a deal in Doha that they have no relationship with anyone, or they don't want Afghanistan to be used. Imam al-Zawahiri is issuing statements waging jihad against the West from Kabul, from Wazir Akbar Khan. And this is something the Taliban or taking Taliban to the brink of destruction, and there is no other alternative but for the Islamic State to fill in. Unfortunately, I don't see, coming to the question of the resistance, I don't see any capacity or leadership in the resistance front. And I don't think it's going to be a situation where we have democratic forces coming and filling the vacuum that is created by the Taliban. I see the Islamic State, I see the jihadists coming and filling the vacuum. And the Taliban are not willing to govern. They're not willing to change. They're not willing. They came with such great PR, with such like optic to change their like the Taliban 2.0 is very different than the Taliban 1.0. No, it is not. The Taliban have not changed, and they're making a mistake. And it's not that the Taliban who are in Kabul, like Muttaqi, like Abbas Stanekzai, and these people, they're pretty pragmatic. They really want to, they're talking to people. They're reaching out to all the Afghans from Washington to Europe to come help us. And now they have lost that faith on the Taliban, and in different layers, they said they don't want to change. Siraj Haqqani gives a video call, his audio is in public. He says that we have given impunity to people, that nobody should harass the former government officials. But Siraj says in the next sentence, we see that every day there is revenge killing, every day there are killing, every day there is looting. One takes somebody's land, one takes somebody's house, and we see kidnapping of women, and exactly what the Mujahideen did after the collapse of Najibullah regime. So with that note, I want to end my comments, and back to you, Antonio and Neil and John.
We'll just answer quickly the question that was asked. And I would also agree that the only thing that the other opposition forces, apart from the Islamic State, can do in the current situation is just to accelerate the collapse of the state. I don't think they can win the war. They are essentially regional forces with no national appeal. So that is only possible achievement. And I think that the assessment also of countries in the region that traditionally have had close links to them, like India, that initially for a period flirted with them, then decided not to support them, instead to engage with the Taliban. I think same assessment. And Iran, that also doesn't see these forces having the real potential. Of course, it's not the interest of Iran to see the state collapse, because chaos would then affect them as well. And I think, by and large, the assessment in the current situation is right. And it could change in the future. Maybe at some point, some more national type of opposition force might emerge. I'm skeptical, because there was never something like that in Afghanistan. So I would expect perhaps the opposition to further spread, but would be, again, regionalized, local, and therefore still leading the same direction. And then we stop here.
Thank you very much, Antonio, for that. I'm afraid this has been very, very interesting, but we'll have to call it a day now. And this will be available as an unedited recording on our website for those who may have missed it today and may want to watch it again. But I always say at the end of, we do an event every teaching week. And I always say at the end of all the events I do that we really cannot put this together unless all of you experts give freely of your time, of your intellect, of your ideas to help us put this together. And the overall impact it has on a global audience, which has been one of the very few positive outcomes of the pandemic, that we're able to do so many things online, is something that we do not underestimate at any point. And I do want to thank all of you for giving your time and your ideas. I say this again, we can't do this without all of you. So Barak Mendelsohn, Ashley Jackson, Ali Mohammad Ali, and Antonio Giustozzi, thank you very much. And we will be back with our next event on Sri Lanka on Tuesday. But for the moment, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, guys.